Hi, we're having a conversation with Markus Mobius. Welcome, Markus. You've been here as one of our plenary speakers for the Antigua Experimental Economics Conference. Markus, you started with studying mathematics, and then you did your master's in economics, and then you went on in England, and then you went on to do your PhD in economics at MIT. How was the transition from mathematics to economics, and how did you get interested in economics? Or how did you get interested in switching from math to econ?
Yeah, so when I did mathematics, I wanted to do something more applied eventually. I already was signed up for a DPhil in mathematics, and I decided in the last moment I wanted to do something more applied. I had several friends who were doing economics, and so I decided to do a master instead. And I had a hard time initially because economics has many models. You know, for somebody who comes from mathematics, it looks a little bit untidy. There are different assumptions for different types of models in industrial organization and finance and so on. So I had a hard time initially, and then I do my PhD in MIT, and that really changed my whole outlook, because one thing I learned at MIT is that models serve to understand reality, and a model is only useful if it explains something about reality. And and that was a moment when I started to actually not look for inspirations in mathematics to apply to economics, but actually I started reading the newspaper. I started reading stories that have economic content, and then I thought about ways of modeling them. And I went the other way around, and I think that's when I made the transition from being more of a mathematician to an economist, when I didn't start from mathematics, but I started from economics to look for ideas.
So basically you switched and you started using economic insights or intuitions, or even everyday intuitions, and used only the tools of mathematics in order to apply it, to formalize it.
Yes, that's right. For example, for somebody who comes from mathematics, there's always a little bit of it's seductive to look for mathematical models, for example, in networks. They're models from interacting particle systems and so on, and you can apply them to economics. But these models never fully really capture the economics. It's more like you're trying to adapt some mathematical model to apply there. And I started to enjoy economics when I stopped doing that, when I went the other way around. When I looked for inspiration in stories for economic history or in newspaper articles, and that's when it actually became really interesting.
And part of your research has been precisely in networks and economic networks. How did you get started into networks, basically using network analysis in economics, and what have been your main findings?
I got interested in networks because it was, when I started doing my PhD, network research just started. It was a new field. And I initially started doing networks from a theoretical perspective. I had theoretical models of networks. For example, I studied residential segregation, and I studied competition between different telephone companies and telephone networks. But I started that from a theoretical perspective. And then I soon discovered that basically when you do theory on networks, there are too many. Theory is kind of hard because there are too many equilibria. For example, it's a repeated game on a network, and it's very easy to generate many stories which are consistent. And so what you need is data, or you need even better experiments to tell you what is going on. And experiments are very natural in social networks simply because there are so many other effects which could explain things. So for example, if you look at social learning, you and I could be friends, and we could know the same thing because we either learned from each other, which would be social learning, or we could know the same things because we read the same newspaper, which would be a kind of common shock. Or maybe we know the same things because I looked for somebody who's like me, I found you, and that's why we know the same things. But it has nothing to do for us to learn from each other. And this is very hard to tease apart if you just have observational data. But if you have experiments, then basically I can do an experiment, for example, where I tell you something, and then I can later find out that you tell me. And so this is basically why experiments are very natural when it comes to social networks. And my main research has been on trust and on social learning. And on trust, the findings we had was trying to understand what is trust worth. And for example, in developing countries, you often have social networks which organize risk sharing, and they organize informal lending. And so we wanted to understand how much is this really worth. For example, if you are a leader in the community, or you know the leader in the community, what does this mean in terms of getting access to resources? And also, what does it mean? Is it important that you just know one? Is it important that you know several of them? Is it just as good to know somebody who knows a leader in the community? So we wanted to understand, given your position in the social network, how much access to resources can you get, and how efficient is a social network in providing those resources? We found that basically when it comes to lending, it's very important whom you know. When it comes to risk sharing, actually social networks tend to be very efficient, and that's consistent with other work that hasn't looked so much at social networks, but that has found that on aggregate social communities are quite good in sharing risk.
And right now you're in Microsoft research and using experiments, using econometrics, and also doing network analysis. Seems to be a very natural fit for this. Can you tell us a little bit what you do or how all these things are related?
Yeah, so for example, I can tell you about two projects. One is a project on Twitter. So this is a field experiment where this is, I'm working with some people who are at the World Bank in Indonesia, and they know celebrities. And so we were thinking about what could we do with these celebrities. Well, these celebrities are on Twitter. So Microsoft happens to have access to the Twitter firehose, so we get all the tweets people send. And so we were interested in, could we have these celebrities send some tweets and then follow up later on, if these tweets are retweeted, for example. And so we were thinking about a vaccination campaign. So this is a campaign where Indonesian children are not sufficiently vaccinated. We have these celebrities, they signed up to a Twitter app, so they gave us access to their account, and so we can send tweets on their behalf. And then we can basically see, if these celebrities tweet about this vaccination campaign, how much is it retweeted? And we also measure how many people show up at vaccination centers and how they heard about it. We do surveys. And so we can actually see, whether this campaign is efficient in terms of, raising support for vaccinations, or whether this is all just an online effect. One criticism of these online campaigns is that they lead to slacktivism, which is basically that people, they send a lot of tweets and retweets, but nothing really happens.
No offline behavior.
Exactly. And so we want to measure the online and the offline behavior, and the online behavior is going to be experimentally induced. And so we're using Microsoft data, we're working together with academics, we're working together with people at the World Bank, we're working with these celebrities, so we're bringing these things together to pull this off. And it would be hard to do if we wouldn't be at Microsoft, because very few academic institutions have access to the Twitter firehose. So this is one example. The other one is a project I'm doing with Susan Athey, who is also a Microsoft visitor. What we are checking is we're looking at how people consume news. And so we're using browsing data from Microsoft for a large number of users to understand how people consume news when they directly navigate to it, and how they consume news when they go to social media. And because increasingly consumption is going from direct navigation to social media, we want to understand what implications does this have for the type of news we consume. For example, do we read fewer celebrity news? Do we read news which is more short-lived? Do we lose interest in things like global warming, which are topics which require a lot of background reading, and maybe are better for newspapers and journals, but maybe they're better for social media. These are things we don't know the answer to, but these are going to be big shifts which are going to become stronger, and we can analyze them using this data which we have access to.
This is very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a great conversation, and thank you for watching.